Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 38. In this week's episode, I want to talk about how being raised by an emotionally immature parent and the resulting trauma, these behaviors that we develop out of survival, can sometimes trickle down and bleed into other relationships in our lives, specifically friendships. And so if you have found it challenging to maintain relationships or to navigate changing dynamics within a friendship, this episode is for you. And I think it's only appropriate to start this week's conversation by bringing it back and taking a look at what friendship looked like and meant for a lot of us who were raised in toxic environments. I touched on this in last week's podcast episode, that up until around age 8, school, which is such a great opportunity for socialization, I think, was just as much about learning for me as it was seeing my friends. I had a pretty good group of friends when I was younger. I would be excited to go over their house. They would come over to my house for play dates. I felt comfortable in these new and different environments and without my parents. But beyond age 8, I felt like my friendships and my social life were neglected by my parents and subsequently by me. And I've heard a lot of people say that if you're trying to learn something new, the earlier the better. Whether you're trying to learn how to play an instrument or trying to learn a second language, the best time to do those things is in early childhood, because our brains are so absorbent and capable of taking on so much new information at once. And I think the same is true for socialization. If from a young age you're properly socialized, you're encouraged to make friends and to develop these lasting relationships with peers of yours, I think that can make understanding group dynamics and feeling comfortable in social settings that much easier as you get older and move throughout your teens and into your early 20s and the rest of your adult life. I think it can make being outgoing feel like it comes much more naturally to you. I also think that in those early childhood friendships is where we can be exposed to a lot of really important socially developmental moments, like healthy conflict resolution. Maybe you're in the schoolyard and someone hurts your feelings, a friend of yours. You have to navigate how to accept an apology from that person. How do you move on after your feelings are hurt? There are so many dynamics, I think, that you can be exposed to when you have these early childhood friendships and relationships. But when you're dealing with an emotionally immature parent, and this isn't a new concept, your wants, needs, and development even are secondary to whatever it is that's going on in their life. And when you're a kid, you're not necessarily in a position of authority to say, well, I'm going over so-and-so's house at this time, or so-and-so is coming over on this day. You can ask for these things to happen, but at the end of the day, you're not the decision maker. And so your socialization can largely depend on where that falls on your parents' priority list. You're kind of left to deal with whatever they have planned for you. And that can be really challenging because emotionally immature parents and narcissistic parents thrive on supply. They're looking for your availability, your time and energy. And you having plans outside of your immediate family, you having a busy calendar with play dates with friends and all of these things that are really nourishing this side of you, all those things are going to do is take you away from them, make you less available to them, and potentially expose you to other healthier parent-child relationship dynamics, which can be so threatening for them. And so you've got the logistics. That's sort of one aspect of it. And for me, I know that for most of my childhood, it sort of felt like my parent wanted me to feel misunderstood by my peers. Like I didn't entirely fit in, like I was kind of different from everyone else, and that I shouldn't care about what kids my age thought of me because it really didn't matter. And this led to a lot of isolation and ostracism for me as I got a little bit older. And in reflecting on that time in my life, I can't help but wonder if throughout my parents' childhood, they felt like an outcast or an outsider. Maybe they felt chronically misunderstood by their friends or family. And since they viewed me as an extension of them, were they trying to foster those beliefs in me to sort of deepen that bond And it goes hand in hand with enmeshment, this inappropriate closeness that a narcissistic parent will develop with their child. It kind of felt like my parent wanted me to feel like no one else in the world understood us, like we were the only two people who really got each other. Because if I didn't feel a sense of camaraderie amongst my peers, if I didn't even have a single friend, all that's left is my family. And the result of that, I think, especially when you're dealing with a parent-child relationship, is this undying loyalty, which is exactly what a narcissistic parent will thrive on because they rely on external validation. They are incapable of regulating their own emotions, and so they need someone who is by their side constantly to do that for them. They need that reassurance, and I think more often than not, it's their child who provides that for them. And so we've got the logistics, which are one aspect of it. And then we've also got this chronically misunderstood narrative that I think can sometimes be instilled and reinforced by a narcissistic parent to completely minimize your socialization, your social experience, and as a result, your support system outside of your immediate family. And I think what can happen when you're dealing with the resulting isolation and ostracism is that not only will you have a harder time understanding and feeling comfortable in group settings, you won't have as much practice navigating these changing dynamics within a friendship, but I think it can also sometimes put that much more pressure on finally finding a friend group. It's kind of one of those things where the longer you go without it, the more you crave it. And I think it can get to a point where you start to turn a lot of that focus inward and feel like there's something wrong with you, like you might be the root of the problem because why am I the only one without a friend? I would say that I experienced the most isolation amongst my peers from 6th to 8th grade. That was when kids in my class started having a little bit more independence. They started hanging out a little bit more on their own and developing friendships outside of school. And I was never really allowed to take part in any of that. But then I get to high school and I find this really great group of people and we form a really tight-knit friend group. I was so happy to sort of reconnect with that social, outgoing side of me. It was refreshing and reassuring to know that that was still there and that I still had the opportunity to make these lasting friendships. I was so happy that kids my age finally liked me, that I was fitting in and that they wanted me to be included. I think feeling like people want you to be a part of whatever it is that they're doing is such a wonderful feeling. And I felt so lucky for that to be a part of my life at that time. And I think one of the great things about high school compared to elementary school is that you have certain academic or athletic obligations and responsibilities that are going to force you to be in these social circles, these social environments for prolonged periods of time. I couldn't go home for lunch anymore, so I was in the lunchroom with my friends and all the other kids. I played sports, and so I had hours-long practices and bus rides to and from games after school. I was seeing people that I wouldn't see in my classes every day, and I was prompted to make new connections consistently. And so I have this really great group of friends, and most of us maintained this group for nearly a decade. We did a really great job of keeping in touch throughout college, living in different states, even in different countries at certain times. And so this is where things start to take a little bit of a turn for me. I moved out of my parents' house when I was 21. And the way that it happened was very sudden and very traumatic and resulted in me enduring some pretty severe separation anxiety. And I think it was just a result of experiencing firsthand such a significant loss in my relationship with my parents. I think experiencing those emotions and understanding that people who had been in your life forever, your support system, who you thought would be in your life for the rest of their lives, could overnight no longer be a part of your life, was jarring and shocking and traumatic. And I think the resulting separation anxiety informed a lot of my emotions and reactions and decisions sort of subconsciously, because this was all before I knew really anything about mental health or anxiety or trauma, never mind separation anxiety. And so a lot of the things that I was doing believing that nothing underlying was informing these things. I was just sort of living my life and doing what felt right. And so for a couple of years after I moved out, that separation anxiety was a driving force in a lot of my decisions, in the way that I chose to live my life. And I didn't even understand the connection between those two things yet. All I knew was that I had a very hard time being alone, which I think partially was a result of never being allowed to develop my individuality or my independence because I was so controlled and sheltered throughout my childhood. But anytime my husband and I would be away from each other, even for a short period of time, I was terrified that something was going to happen that was going to keep us from seeing each other. We wouldn't be able to be together anymore. And that scared me so deeply. I think especially after having lost those relationships with my parents, to now even entertain the idea that I could potentially lose this relationship too was entirely overwhelming. I had nightmares about it. I had intrusive thoughts and so much anxiety. And again, this was all before I was able to put words to these emotions. And then 2020, COVID hit, and my husband and I were quarantining together. And that time, I think, was an invitation for isolation for a lot of people. I was now being told that I couldn't go anywhere or do anything with anyone besides who I was with. And in a lot of ways, I think that time sort of intensified a lot of these feelings of separation anxiety. My husband and I were in the early stages of our relationship, and we were also building a business together. So we were quarantining together, we were living together, working together, and building a business together. And once things started to return to normal, my friends and I had already not been seeing each other as regularly as normal. Planning issues, we lived in different states. There was obviously COVID, so there were a lot of restrictions. I think a lot of times the timing just didn't match up. But on the few times that we would all get together or they were around, I didn't feel comfortable being without my husband. I couldn't show up for them in the same way that I had in the past. I didn't feel physically or emotionally capable of just going out and doing things on my own or with them. Everything in my life in those last 2 years had been turned upside down, and I was in the very early stages of deconstructing and redefining some of my most foundational beliefs, all the while navigating this really traumatic time with my immediate family. And I think there was such an interesting duality present in my life at that time, because I had just met my husband not long before, and I was head over heels in love with him. I was so thrilled. I just wanted to be around him all the time. And I think part of the reason why is because he was the first person to ever truly show me unconditional love. I could be myself around him. I didn't have to put on a show, and he loved me for that. And it was so refreshing and reassuring. It was almost addicting. All the while, he and I had come together and we were building a business together. This business that I had dreamt of, that we had manifested, was now coming to fruition right in front of us. And for anyone who is a business owner or has been their own boss, you understand the long hours and days that you have to put in, especially in the early stages of a business. You are wearing all the hats, and if you are not getting things done, then things aren't getting done. And so there was a tremendous responsibility that I felt on my shoulders to make this business work. It was such a positive way for me to direct my time and energy at such a tumultuous time in my life. As I was just starting to uncover little bits about mental health and make sense of some of the relationship dynamics between my parents and myself, but at the same time, it felt like as I was fulfilling all of these aspects of my new life, there was a lot of my old life that was sort of falling away. My relationship with my parents was the worst that it had ever been, and my relationships with my 3 closest friends were deteriorating. And I want to preface this by saying that, on the Am I the Asshole subreddit, I think this was an everyone sucks here kind of situation, because I don't place blame on any one side. I don't think that any one person was responsible for the way that things happened and ended. But ultimately, my separation anxiety prevented me from showing up for my friends in the way that I had in the past, in the way that they had grown accustomed to. And this all came to a head at one point, and I addressed it, which was difficult enough as it is, having such a limited knowledge on emotional intelligence and communication and my fear of controversy. I didn't entirely know what was going on, but I expressed to the best of my ability what had changed in my life and how I was feeling. And I didn't plan on things being like this forever, but for the time being, this is how I need to live my life. And I was proud of myself for at least understanding and doing that much. I was proud that I was brave enough to voice these concerns of mine and to kind of set the record straight as best as I could at the time. But I understand that if I didn't even fully understand what I was going through, how can I expect other people in my life to understand it? And it must have been very challenging for our friendship dynamic to change as a result of my separation anxiety. And ultimately, that conversation is what led to the end of our friendship. And it was devastating for a long time. I think especially because at that time in my life, I hadn't yet developed that self-awareness. I hadn't yet learned how to acknowledge or process my emotions or to effectively communicate how I was feeling. I think I also got defensive in light of any kind of controversy. I was never taught healthy conflict resolution, and so it all felt very overwhelming for me. And I think to have my attempt to explain myself and to lay as much as I knew about what I was going through out there result in the end of nearly a decade-long friendship was really challenging. And the reason that I think this is important to talk about is because that it's undeniable that going through something like this doesn't impact your self-confidence. Despite how you might feel personally, when you experience any kind of rejection from people that you have known for a substantial amount of time, who you believed to have known you deeply, they know stories about you, you've shared experiences together, I think it can be a real blow to your confidence. And it can lead you in future friendships to overthink and overanalyze social interactions. Am I being too much? Does this person really like me? Am I doing the same thing that I did then, now? Should I not do this? Do they really not want me to be here? How did they mean that? And that can be so challenging because there's this lingering self-doubt, I think. And for me, to have experienced losing my 3 closest friends so closely to losing my relationship with my parents was absolutely devastating. Despite my personal confidence and understanding that I was making the right decision for me, I was doing what I felt I needed to do in the moment to get me through that time in my life, it doesn't always make it easier to reconcile. And I think what that self-doubt does is it prompts you to kind of reflect on your role. And for me, now not only was it my role within my family, but it was also my role within my friendships. I was wondering if they viewed our friendship the same, if it meant the same thing to them as it did to me, if friendship in general meant something different for them. How did they truly view me and perceive me? And it brought to the surface a handful of experiences where something was said or done that I didn't entirely feel great about. But I remember saying to myself, well, I want to be friends with them at the end of the day. So what's the point of even bringing it up? Like, I can handle this on my own and I'm just going to let it go. And I've talked to some people about this, and I've read some people's stories about this, that when you're raised by an emotionally immature parent, you're not taught to stand up for yourself. You are kind of encouraged to just let things go and to keep the peace. And I started to wonder how much of that I was bringing into my friendships. I didn't have any boundaries. I never caused any problems. I think I was always fearful of speaking up in some ways because I felt like I might lose these people, and it never felt worth it for me. I never wanted to be the center of any kind of negativity. And I think it's also important to mention that when you're raised in that kind of environment, you're conditioned to believe that the way to make a connection with someone is by becoming an extension of them, by taking on their interests as your own. And so I think in a lot of ways, I was incredibly malleable. I think I was always willing to go out of my way and to make the effort. And I always would let things go. To me, it felt like our friendship was more important than any of those small things. But I think at the end of the day, those small things turned out to be not so small. But it wasn't until I started to develop my identity and my self-worth, and I was able to start setting boundaries and stop neglecting myself, that I was able to see that. I think, this is an aspect of healing that isn't talked about as often, but I think it's very real, that as you start to heal these different parts of yourself, as you learn to set boundaries and to prioritize yourself, your circle might become much smaller. And you may no longer maintain relationships with people who you believed for certain would be in your life for the rest of your life. And that can be a really challenging thing to experience, losing these different relationships and going through that grieving process, maybe not only with your family, but also now with your friends. But anytime that I find myself feeling sad about friendships that have come and gone, what I always come back to are the people who saw me through the most challenging time of my life and who stood by me through it all, despite maybe not understanding what I was going through, despite me not being able to fulfill the role that I had in the past. And I think the difference for me that I've started to realize is that some relationships are transactional, and if you do what is expected of you, then that relationship can continue. And I think other relationships are unconditional, and it doesn't necessarily matter the role that you fulfill or what you're going through in your own life. There's this love and care that is unchanging, and that is invaluable. And so I wanted to talk about this week because this is something that I'm currently feeling and attempting to reconcile in my own life. And I really enjoy talking about things that are happening in my life right now because the emotions feel very raw and I feel very in touch with them. And I guess before I wrap up this week's episode, I just want to encourage you to be patient with yourself as you move through this grieving process, because I think in a lot of ways, that's what it is. I think I went through a very similar grieving process with my friends as I did with my parents, accepting this loss where these relationships, these people are still physically here. And there is an opportunity for this relationship to continue if you do something, if you agree to this, that, and the other thing, if you can show up in the way that you're expected to show up. There are a lot of complex emotions, I think, that go hand in hand with a friend breakup. And I think it's really important for you to allow yourself the time to grieve these relationships, but to understand that there will be people in your life who will see you through the most challenging times, and they will not leave. And those are the people who make having a smaller circle worth it. And so with that, I think I'm going to be wrapping up this week's episode. If you enjoyed this week's episode, I hope you were able to take something positive from it. At the very least, just understanding that if you've gone through something like this, you are not alone. Please be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify, please be sure to leave us a rating. I will be back next week with another episode of It's Not Normal, the podcast. Bye.